Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chip O'Brien, President of the Savannah Council on World Affairs, and we welcome back our members and guests to our fourth national live stream presentation this fall, focused this time on the issues of human trafficking. Our board and I feel that there has never been a more important time to engage our community in an ongoing conversation about US foreign policy and the challenges our country faces internationally. We are all hopeful that a vaccine will become available later this winter so that we can return to our in-person presentation format later on in 2021. Meanwhile, continue to check our website, savannahcwa.org, for future programs, recordings of past programs, and the many offerings by the World Affairs Councils around the country, which are being made available to communities like our own. This afternoon, we will be presented with a sobering analysis by Susan Snyder of the State Department on the issues of human trafficking, issues which we face around the world as well as locally. Jim Van Epps will introduce our speaker and handle questions which you can submit by using the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. First, though, let me reiterate our thanks for the outstanding support that we are given all year by our platinum sponsor, Kreitz Auto Group, who sells and services BMW, Mercedes, Buick, GMC, and Sprinter vans. We also very much appreciate our newest program sponsor, St. Peter's Episcopal Church here on Skidaway Island. We are delighted that St. Peter's has honored us with a sponsorship to recognize the importance of your council's mission in the community. These two sponsors, together with our members' dues and guest fees, enable us to bring you these programs and fund our study abroad scholarships for Savannah State and Georgia Southern University students. We have made it very easy for you to join, renew, or donate by visiting our website. So now let me hand the mic virtually over to my fellow director, Jim Van Epps, who will introduce our speaker. Jim?
Got it. Thank you, Chip. And good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon's presentation by Susan Snyder is very interesting and unfortunately always timely. We have not had a presentation that we will, as we will hear this afternoon, that so deals with the individual human condition as the one we're about to hear. But to begin, we're also joined by Irina Karmanova, a public affairs specialist in the Bureau of Global Public Affairs of the Department of State. Irina has a brief video clip on the State Department she'd like us to view. And Irina, at this point, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. I'm happy to be here, excited to engage with your audience. My office, the Office of Public Liaison at the State Department, seeks to coordinate dialogue between the State Department and the American public, and we absolutely love working with World Affairs Councils, so thank you so much for this opportunity. I'd like to play a short video that's a quick introduction to the State Department before turning it over to our main speaker.
It's a wonderful and complex world out there, filled with challenges and opportunities. That's why America's diplomats with the U.S. Department of State are on the job every day, representing you. We are advancing America's foreign policy interests by uniting our allies, confronting our adversaries, and protecting our citizens. We advance democracy, human rights, global health, and more. We grow markets that create American jobs. We are America's first federal agency, and we're in 190 countries at over 270 U.S. embassies and consulates, serving you. We are the United States Department of State.
So, Arena, again, thank you so much for that delightful video. We're proud of the work that you do on our behalf as citizens of the United States. And that video makes us proud also to be Americans. Thank you again. Our speaker this afternoon is Susan Snyder. She is the Senior Coordinator in International Programs in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons in the United States Department of State. A little bit about Susan's background. She has more than 25 years of experience working on foreign assistance programs in both the State Department and the United Nations system. Currently, she manages trafficking in persons foreign assistance programs for the Department of State within the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. She's responsible for overseeing crucial training and technical assistance to help trafficking victims and survivors, and to ensure trafficking criminals face significant consequences. Recently, Susan led the Division for Design and Learning within the department's Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. The term, the short term is INL for short, and I recommend that you try to remember that because you'll hear it again, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. And in that role in the Knowledge Management Office, creating standard practices for program design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Previously, Susan was the Office Director for the INL Anti-Crime Program Office, overseeing bilateral, regional, and multilateral policies and programs on a range of crime topics, including corruption, money laundering, border security, cybercrime, wildlife trafficking. In this position, she also managed the 5 international law enforcement academies that train law enforcement officers from around the world. Susan served for more than 4 years as Deputy Director of the INL Western Hemisphere Programs Office, managing programming of $500 million annually. Also in INL, she worked for 2 years on justice and other related programs in Africa and Asia. Based at the US Embassy in South Africa, Susan was the department's Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs Officer for Southern and Eastern Africa for almost 4 years. Susan also worked for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, on counterterrorism issues, and for the International Atomic Energy Agency on cancer prevention. Susan's married, enjoys cooking, traveling, and reading. Delightful. She's also an active member of a greyhound rescue organization fostering retired greyhounds. She spends as much time as possible outside with her husband and their greyhound, Stella. For her undergraduate studies, Susan studied at Juniata, a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, and received her master's degree at what is now the National Intelligence University. In sum, terrific credentials for our presentation this evening on State Department efforts to combat trafficking in persons. So to begin, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the Palermo Protocol on Trafficking in Persons both turned 20 years old this year. Susan's talk will give an overview of what trafficking is, what the law and protocol do. It'll go over what's been accomplished over the past 20 years and discuss what we've learned, how the government is organized to fight against trafficking and what still needs to be done. And she will conclude by providing practical suggestions for getting involved in the trafficking effort. Following her presentation, Susan will take questions from our viewers that can easily be sent via, as Chip mentioned, the Zoom Q&A on your screen or on your iPad. Just click on the Q&A icon, a box will appear. Simply type in your question, push the send button. It's that simple. And I suggest you send your questions in quickly or early, as we'll have a better chance to get them asked in the time that we have. Our Q&A session is projected to end at 5 p.m. It's a little bit here. So let me get out of the way and say that it is my honor to present Susan Snyder. Susan, it is great to have you join us this afternoon, even in this venue.
Thanks so much, Jim. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me here to speak about trafficking in persons and the work that the State Department is doing to stop it. As Jim mentioned, I've been in the State Department for a long time. Listening to him go over my resume, it seems like I must be very ancient, but actually I started when I was very young. How about that? And as Jim mentioned as well, I worked on a wide variety of criminal justice issues, and I'm really thrilled now to be working on trafficking in persons. It's very rewarding, especially because we hear regularly about the people's lives that we've touched and helped. So Jim mentioned what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give you an overview of the laws and international standards that guide against trafficking, including the definition, because definitions are very important in this topic. And then we'll talk about the different forms of trafficking, the tools that we have available to combat it, some of our accomplishments. And then I'm going to share with you what our office does and how we work with survivors of trafficking. And finally, I'll end, as Jim said, by giving you some tangible ways to help with this important work. And I do have a PowerPoint, so let me pause here and see if we can get that up on the screen. All right, so the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. 20 years ago, the United States Congress passed a monumental piece of legislation, the Trafficking Victims in Person Act of 2000. We like to call it the TVPA for short. This was a bipartisan effort to codify the protections of some of the most vulnerable people in our society and hold human traffickers accountable for their crimes. The law is based on the fundamental principle that trafficking in persons is an affront to human dignity, and all trafficking victims, whether they're US citizens or foreign nationals, whether they're in the United States or abroad, whether they're adults or children exploited for sex or labor trafficking, they all need protection. The passage of the TVPA is also significant because it is the first comprehensive federal law to address trafficking in persons. The law provides the United States governments with the tools necessary to combat the wide range of tactics by which modern traffickers operate. The TVPA works to combat all forms of trafficking, and it established the office I work in currently, the Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, or just for short, the TIP office. Since the passage of the TVPA, all 50 states have passed additional laws to combat trafficking. Next slide, please. This year also marks the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons in Palermo, Italy. The protocol was the first international agreement on trafficking in persons and demonstrated a fundamental shift in the international approach to the exploitation of individuals for private profit. The protocol was also the first international treaty to provide a broad definition of trafficking, recognize multiple facets of trafficking, and promote full respect of the victim's human rights. Over the past 20 years, nearly every country in the world has enacted laws to criminalize all forms of trafficking in persons. There is nearly universal agreement on the importance of implementing policies and protocols to detect, investigate, and prosecute human trafficking cases and to assist its victims. To date, there are 178 states parties to the protocol. Next slide, please. Before we go further, it's important to note that in our line of work, we use certain terms broadly, like human trafficking or modern slavery. And for us, they encompass the full range of the trafficking crime, from sex trafficking to forced labor. Next, please. Both the TVPA and the Palermo Protocol introduced for the first time nonviolent coercion or exploitation into the definition of trafficking. This was a development that came about because of a deeper understanding of the crime that was being perpetrated. Traffickers use many forms of coercion to control or intimidate their victims. Some of their tactics include isolation, the use of debt, the confiscation of identity or travel documents, and threats of prison or deportation, especially if the individual is in the country illegally. Traffickers also deceive victims about the terms of their employment or living conditions, and it is common for traffickers to use the threat of violence towards victims or their families. There was a story in the news this week from California that unfortunately illustrates this. A man from India came with the US with a couple who promised him travel and financial independence. Once in the US, they took his passport and other forms of identity, forced him to live and work in their liquor store for 15 hours a day and didn't pay him. This went on for several years. Thankfully, his situation was discovered by a liquor license inspector who also discovered several other poor souls in this situation at their other businesses. Next slide, please. Children under the age of 18 are always considered trafficked when they're used in commercial sex, regardless of force, fraud, or coercion. This is an important definitional distinction and recognizes the special and vulnerable circumstances of children. I'll also mention here another myth that often comes up in trafficking. An individual does not have to cross an international boundary or even leave one's hometown to be trafficked. The term trafficking can be misleading as it implies movement. The key to identifying trafficking is to identify the compelled service, coercion, or exploitation for labor or sex. Next slide, please. As I've touched upon, there are many different types of and forms of trafficking. I'm just going to go through a few of them here. Sex trafficking is when an adult is coerced, forced, or deceived into prostitution, or when they are maintained in prostitution through coercion. We've already discussed what child sex trafficking is. And on a side note, I'll just mention with the advent of COVID-19, we've seen a very stark increase in children being sexually exploited online, especially in Asia and Africa. According to recent studies, forced labor now constitutes the majority of human trafficking around the world. Forced labor is when a person benefiting from the child's work is someone outside of the child's family. Bonded labor is the use of a bond or a debt as a form of coercion to keep someone in a compelled state of service. And typically this is an arrangement where a person is forced to pay off a debt with direct labor over a period of time. Domestic servitude refers to domestic workers who typically work without contracts in unregulated workplaces. The lack of legal protections combined with the social isolation and general lack of personal autonomy inherent in a live-in domestic service situation are all enablers for involuntary servitude. And finally, there's the unlawful recruitment or use of child soldiers, which is pretty self-explanatory. Next slide, please. There are no perfect or definitive estimates for how many trafficking victims there are in the world, but the best estimate that we've comes from the International Labor Organization, which estimates there are about 25 million victims of trafficking around the world. Human trafficking is a high reward, low risk crime, and the traffickers know it. Next slide, please. The tools we use to fight against trafficking crimes can be categorized into what we call the 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution. We've added a fourth, partnership, over the last 20 years that we've been with this. These tools translate into what we in the US have, as well as what we encourage all countries to do around the world to fight against trafficking. Our foreign assistance programs all fit under these umbrella categories and outline the framework for our work. In order to prevent trafficking, we must first recognize it. We work with all manner of officials all around the world to teach them to recognize or identify victims of trafficking. These people include teachers, doctors, other health officials, customs and immigration officers, labor inspectors, police, social workers, and many more. We also have programs that work in communities with local leaders to educate them on trafficking, how to recognize it, and who to report it to. In Ghana, our implementers have worked for years in the villages surrounding Lake Volta to educate community members on the horrors of trafficking and provide alternatives for families who send their small sons to work on fishing vessels or who send their daughters to work as live-in domestic help. The alternatives often involve establishing institutions that provide microloans to families to sustain them in hard times without sending their children away, thus relieving the pressure on the family. Progress is often slow and change is very hard, but there are now established systems in these communities to prevent this type of trafficking from happening and to ultimately punish the criminals who are benefiting from it. Once we recognize trafficking victims, we must then be able to provide them protection from their traffickers. Most commonly, shelters are used around the world for this purpose. And once in shelters, victims often need extensive psychological and medical services in addition to basic clothing and food. Many shelters we support around the world, whether run by governments or non-governmental organizations, also try and provide some sort of integration support. This may look like a training in a certain skill or education, or something that will help the victim move on from this trauma and do something different in their lives going forward. Sometimes protection also involves the return of a survivor to his or her country of origin. During recent times, because of COVID-19, many victims of forced labor in the Middle East were thrown out of their place of work, whether in domestic homes or in factories, and many had nowhere to turn. One of our programs with the International Organization of Migration helps many of these victims who are trafficked return home and reintegrate into their societies and families if that's possible. Next is prosecution, and it should come as no surprise to you that not all trafficking laws around the world are good ones. It's taken us some time to recognize this, and we spend quite a bit of time and effort working with countries to ensure their laws have different definitions of trafficking that adhere to those in the International Palermo Protocol and cover all forms of and all victims of trafficking, including children and men. We also urge countries to have stiff enough penalties to be a deterrent to these criminals. Once trafficking laws are adequate, we then spend a lot of energy training police officers and prosecutors how to investigate and prosecute these unique crimes. As we discussed earlier, these crimes involve some sort of coercion, and that must be discovered and backed up by evidence. This isn't always easy for law enforcement and prosecutors around the world. We teach criminal justice actors how to build such cases, emphasizing how to treat the victims and not re-traumatize or re-victimize them. People who have been exploited are key to investigations and prosecutions, but often they need to recover and work through their trauma before they can recognize what happened to them as trafficking and provide witness to what they experienced. This is why the protection element is so critical and why the criminal justice actors need to work closely with those protecting victims of trafficking. Under this category, we also train judges and give assistance to specialized trafficking courts and help countries who are willing to set up specialized units for investigators and prosecutors. Finally, I added partnership here as the fourth P, because we've learned over the past 20 years that when all elements involved in trafficking, from communities, social services, non-governmental organizations, and criminal justice sectors, not to mention international cooperation between countries, when all these elements are working together, the outcome is always, always much better. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to talk about our office. Our office was also established by the TVPA 20 years ago in October, and it's been given a very wide mandate. I'm going to talk about some of these issues in later slides, but our key responsibilities are laid out here in reporting, diplomacy, assistance, outreach, and interagency coordination. Next slide, please. We go through all of those. Thank you. The TVPA mandated the Trafficking in Persons report. This is the US government's principal diplomatic tool for engaging foreign governments on human trafficking. It is also the world's most comprehensive resource of governmental anti-trafficking efforts for 188 countries around the world and reflects the US government's commitment to global leadership on this key human rights and law enforcement issue. Through the TIP report, the Department of State places each country in one of 3 tiers based on the extent of the government's compliance with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking that are found in the TVPA. Each country narrative also has recommendations where governments could improve. The report is on the State Department's website, which I'll share with you at the end. Next slide, please. International programs is my area of expertise, and I touched on the program we conduct around the world under the 3 Ps. We enjoy wide bipartisan support for our foreign assistance programming and have reached and helped hundreds of thousands of people around the world with our efforts. This year in May, we launched an innovative project with the University of Georgia's African Program and Research Initiative to End Slavery, or APRE, to work with prominent academics from around the world to discover the best methodology and techniques for studying hidden populations. This work will be collated into a meta-analysis, the first of its kind for human trafficking. We're very hopeful that this work, combined with rigorous study and evaluations of program interventions, will help us understand which of these interventions work best in which situations to actually reduce the prevalence of trafficking. These are very exciting developments for those of us trying to improve our development projects and wisely use US taxpayer dollars. Over the next years, this should help us better target our interventions and hopefully those of all organizations working on trafficking and actually lower the prevalence of trafficking victims. Next slide, please. Our office is also responsible for a wide range of coordination and public outreach duties on behalf of the whole US government, as you can see here. We work with a wide range of NGOs in the trafficking community. We partner closely with multilateral and international organizations, and we coordinate across all the entities in the US government working on this issue. Next slide. Our office is also responsible for managing the task force and its many subcommittees. This year, we released a new 5-year national action plan against trafficking, and we developed a new website that summarizes and links all the work done across the US government in one place. It's a terrific resource, and I encourage you all to look into it if you're interested. Next slide. Establishing the US Advisory Council Against Human Trafficking is one of the best accomplishments I think we've made over the past 20 years. The US Advisory Council provides a formal platform for trafficking survivors to advise and make recommendations on federal anti-trafficking policy to the Interagency Task Force. Each member is a survivor of human trafficking, and together they represent a diverse range of backgrounds and experiences. My office also uses trafficking survivors' input in our foreign assistance programs to ensure that they're survivor and trauma informed. Next slide. For the 20th anniversary of our office, the TVPA, and the Palermo Protocol, we put together a fact sheet that's on our website. And this fact sheet describes 20 actions that anyone can take to fight human trafficking. I'm going to close by just mentioning 3 of these actions, which are really quite easy. The first is to learn the indicators of human trafficking. You can do this on our office's website or by taking a training. There are lots of them out there. You just have to Google human trafficking identifiers. And human trafficking awareness training is available for individuals, businesses, first responders, law enforcement educators, and federal employees, among others. Secondly, if you're in the US and you believe someone may be a victim of human trafficking, someone, for instance, in your local liquor store or in your nail salon, you can call the 24-hour National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can get it by 911, but also I'm just going to read out the number at 888-373-7888. Trafficking victims, whether or not they're US citizens, are eligible for services and immigration experience. This was codified in the TVPA. And finally, you can be a conscientious and informed consumer. You can find out who may have picked your tomatoes or made your clothes at responsiblesourcingtool.org, or check out the Department of Labor's list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor. This list is kind of a show and tell and encourages companies to take steps to prevent human trafficking in their supply chains by publishing this information, including supplier or factory lists for consumer awareness. So I'm going to stop there, but I'd be very happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Susan, that was terrific. Thank you for an excellent, interesting presentation on what our government, Department of State, is doing to reduce or prevent human trafficking. One thing I'd like to ask, the last slide or second last slide, you gave us a phone number of which I got 4 digits. Could you repeat that again, please?
Yes, it wasn't very well planned. It's 888-373-7888.
That shouldn't have been all that difficult, but thank you. So, I think those of us, and while we might have folks from listening who don't live in Georgia or Savannah, but can you give us, and I realize that your focus is on international programs. Can you give us your understanding as to the human trafficking situation in Georgia and then narrow it down to Savannah, please?
I can try. I can talk maybe a little bit about Georgia, and trafficking prevalence, as we mentioned, is sometimes difficult to quantify because they are pretty hidden populations. So I'm not going to be able to give you numbers, but I can tell you that Georgia is a big success story for interagency cooperation against trafficking. There is an anti-trafficking coordination team here, which is basically they're multi-stakeholders from different agencies. So I'm sure it's the local police, the FBI, maybe DHS is here working with local prosecutors and federal prosecutors, and also working with victim services. The victim services are all government funded, but they're really excellent. And when we bring folks in from overseas to show them how to work together as a government, getting all of those groups together, like I mentioned, we often bring them here to Atlanta, but to Georgia. Our last ambassador, Susan Coppage, was a federal prosecutor, I think, from the Atlanta area as well. So that's what I know about Georgia and the trafficking situation here. I will say that since I started working on trafficking issues, I've been surprised to watch in the local news how prevalent trafficking is in places even where you wouldn't suspect it. So I'm sure it's in everybody's community. I know it's in mine, and we just have to learn how to identify it.
Thank you. That question came from Patty Koch, who lives here locally. A question that came from Sherry LeBlanc is, we see signs in airports that make us aware of possible human trafficking. How often do authorities find victims in our airports, our major airports, and how does the process work once that happens, please?
Sure. Again, I don't have numbers in the US, but I do know that we work overseas to train immigration officers, and our immigration officers here and customs officials are very well trained to look for signs of people who are being forced to travel. Some of those signs are children, people who probably aren't their parents. You can look at documentation and figure that out. You can look at how people are interacting together. Is there a group of, 6 women and 1 man traveling together where the man is holding all of the passports, or one woman is holding all of the passports for everybody? Those are easy signs. Our officials are very well trained in this, and they would probably pull that group of people over for secondary kind of screening or talking. They probably make them wait for a while. Until we're able to do some interviewing and separate some of the people from the others and start asking them questions. Okay. And if they are identified as trafficked victims, they are then immediately referred to services where they can be protected and get the care that they need, because many of them probably have undergone quite some trauma.
Thank you. And I've got one that is from Portia Mashingura, and I'm taking a little liberty. Portia, pardon me if I missed that by much. Her question is, was it a website or a number that allows us to see who's involved in our favorite company's supply chain?
Yes, and I should have put this on a slide. My apologies. So the website that you can look at for the list of companies is called, one word, it's all together, Responsible Sourcing Tool, TOOL.org. And this is the list that encourages companies. They kind of shine the light on the companies that are using forced or child labor in their supply chains. So some garment industries, some shoe companies, that kind of thing.
Could you repeat that, please, for those of us slow on the pencil, please?
My apologies. I speak fast. It's Responsible
Right.
sourcing,
Sourcing.
sourcingtool.org.
Gotcha. Thank you. A question from Olavi Arons, one of our board members, is could you say something about the extent of trafficking, of human trafficking, as he asks, are we talking thousands, tens of thousands? And you've talked about anything in particular that you'd like to say about what the major areas might be. You did break it down to some extent, obviously.
Yeah.
Sex and adult and child and so forth.
Yeah, so the best estimate we have is about 25 million around the world of forced labor victims. So it's quite a lot. I also heard a number that the revenue that's brought in is about 150 billion a year. So it is way, what I said before was that it's a low cost, high benefit crime. So there is a lot. I think this crime makes more money than even drugs do, which is pretty shocking. Jim, what else did you ask me? Oh, the industry. So the industries, I didn't put up this slide, but there's all kinds of like sex trafficking for child and adults. And then there's labor trafficking. And in labor trafficking, it's in a lot of different industries. We've done a lot of work in the past several years about the fishing industry. A lot in Asia, but fishing is now kind of global, so it's everywhere. And once you get people onto fishing vessels, they're often at sea for months and months or even years, and they don't let people go. So fishing is a big industry. In Southeast Asia, there are brick making kilns where there is bonded and forced labor. There are industries in India where carpets are made, where materials are woven, where they employ children, or again, bonded or forced labor. We talked about domestic servitude a bit. So that is a whole nother kind of area where in poorer countries in Africa, sometimes children are sent to live with others in the hope of a better life, and also to relieve the pressure on the family for having to feed them. And many times they're in awful, awful forced labor situations. So those are a few. I'm trying to think of others, but that gives you maybe a good idea.
Agriculture also, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. Yes, agriculture is a big one. Yes, all over the world.
Just
Thanks,
taking a stab. Good. Thank you. So spreading back out again into the international environment, and I realize we're talking, I'm going to ask about the European Union. And has the formation of the European Union had an impact in Europe as well as its impact on the United States?
Yes,
Human trafficking.
So. And I will say that trafficking in persons, when I first heard about it, and the woman in our office who did some of the groundbreaking research at the very beginning, we're really talking about what happened after the Soviet Union broke up in the late 80s, 90s. And people were very poor, and women especially were being exploited. And that's where you had a lot of the stories about sex trafficking and women who were sexually exploited. And that's really where the awareness, I think, started raising. The European Union is highly regulated. Everything has a regulation in the EU, even to like fish. You have to, pass a test and get a license, even more so in the US. Even for horse riding, I was surprised, having lived there for a while. So I think that it is still prevalent there, like it is everywhere, trafficking, but I would like to say it's less, but I don't know that for sure. There are a lot of, so trafficking victims are often found in migration flows, and we're very careful not to mix them up. There are lots of migrants who are seeking a better life in Europe, coming from the Syrian problem. And also from other places, Turkey and others looking for a better life. And then all over Africa, they're coming up through Libya and crossing the Mediterranean. Everyone's seen those desperate, horrific stories of boats capsizing, but all of those folks end up somewhere in Europe, and if they can't find work, or they're desperate, that is where traffickers prey on them. So I can't say whether or not the EU has stopped. They haven't stopped the problem. We still have some programs there, but I think the EU is dealing with it much like we do. So it's, again, one of those things that even the US, it's still there, but it's not. We kind of have figured out the tools to find it and deal with it. I don't know if that answered your question, Jim, but.
I think it does, yes. But I have one more related to that. This is the last question that I have and that I've received so far. And we hear so much about the social programs of, I'll say, the Scandinavian countries. Is this an issue for the Scandinavian countries also, do you believe?
I don't really know the answer to that question. I would imagine that it is, only because in most countries they do have a good social structure. So maybe people aren't as desperate and aren't as willing to, be coerced into things that they wouldn't necessarily have been, coerced into. I don't really know the answer, I have to say. So I'm guessing, but they do have a social support system there that gives people a living wage. And so they may not be as vulnerable as others, and traffickers may not be successful at preying upon them.
Susan, I'm not sure if it's my device but you kind of faded toward the end there, although I did hear what you were saying. I do have another question that comes from Tierra Anthony, and that is, are massage parlors checked for human trafficking? You did mention in nail parlors and so forth earlier.
Yes, no, it's my understanding that, definitely overseas, those are areas where we encourage police and labor inspectors, or whoever it is that inspects businesses. Those are prime areas of target. I know in the US as well, although because they're so, it's kind of an obvious thing, they've gone a little bit underground. So, but yes. Obviously, those are areas where you see a lot of exploitation.
Okay. That is, looking around at everything I have, that is the last question I have. Is there anything you'd like to say in a wrap up?
I would just say that, it's a very interesting topic, and it's kind of something that we can all dig our hands into a little bit, because it is here in our country as well. And just by being made aware of some of the things to look out for, we can all play a part in helping people and really stopping this desperate human rights abuse. It's really horrific. So pay attention. I've been reading the news since I joined the office, and being surprised at how much trafficking there is kind of in our own communities, and keeping your eyes out and being aware.
Just one semi-personal story. I know an FBI agent who was sent to meet a young teenager in southwestern Georgia who had come in, and she was trying to escape from the situation she was in Los Angeles. And so the agent went down, met her, spent a couple days with her, brought her up here brought her to Atlanta, turned her over to the office there. They fed her and so forth and took her back home. They checked on her 2 days later and she was gone again. Just, you don't know what people are looking for sometimes. So, okay. Well, in conclusion, both Susan and Irina, thank you on behalf of the Savannah Council on World Affairs for an interesting video, a terrific presentation, and thoughtful answers to our questions. We're really grateful for your contributions to our program on a topic which, as you remind us, we need to be ever mindful of. And the next time we see you, we hope it'll be in Savannah, the hostess city. So once again, thank you to you both. And at this point, I'd like to conclude this afternoon's program by turning it back over to Chip, but thank you both again.
Thanks very much, Jim. for that. I'm curious if you, Susan, are still able to get back on. I'm curious about your list of countries. Who is on the top of the list as the best actors, and who is at the bottom of the list in terms of countries, the worst actors? Can you give us a sense of that?
That's a good question. I know we rate ourselves in addition to the 188 countries. So the best countries are the ones, I mean, even the US, we're probably, you know, in the top, but even we had 8 or 9 recommendations this year. The folks who are doing well, I think, I was going to say Australia, but maybe not. I needed to have looked this. I can tell you the worst ones better. The best ones are probably the Scandinavian countries, but I'll need to check on that. The worst are, you know, the usual actors. Let me think. North Korea, obviously. I think China. Tier 3 is what we call them. Let's see, Burma may be in the tier 3 or tier 2 watch list. You'll have to look. I didn't come prepared with my list of countries, and for that I apologize, because that would have been an obvious one.
Oh,
I don't want to misspeak.
And also, can you give us a sense of the budget that
Sure.
for your enterprise?
Yes, for my office, we have about $60 million a year that we spend overseas in 90 countries around the world. So that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, but it's not as nearly as much as we spend on, for example, drug trafficking and other forms of transnational crime.
Sure. Wow, it's interesting. Well, thank you. I echo Jim's thanks to you, to Irina, for your informative discussion today. And I know our members and guests have enjoyed it and learned a lot. We'll be much more sensitive now to these issues as we both read the news and walk around our own city and follow events here. So thank you again. I'm going to put up a screen share here, I hope. This is a reminder to you, please join us in only 2 weeks at our next live stream program. This is where retired General Bob Latif, whose topic is preparing for the new global battlefield. You will hear an urgent, prescient, and expert look at how future technology will change virtually every aspect of war as we know it, and how the US can respond to serious national security challenges ahead. And they seem really serious. So until then, please enjoy a happy Thanksgiving, stay safe, and good day from all of us in Savannah.